I'm Leanne Tran, psychologist who's worked with families whose kids don't fit the mould for almost 20 years. I've worked with children for decades, but I know parents are the real change makers when it comes to their kids. Having 3 kids of my own means I know it's not easy. Parent Like a Psychologist is all about simplifying how you support your kids with psychology information filtered through years of experience to take you from overwhelmed to confident. Come on in. Thanks so much for joining me again on Parent Like a Psychologist. It's another book review episode today. And we've been talking a lot about teenagers lately on the pod, so this one is about teens. It's the book I'm reviewing is called Yes, Your Teen is Crazy by Michael Bradley. This one is an older book. I think it was 2002 originally, when it was originally published. So, I mean, lots of times the information in psychology does not change that much over that time. Sorry, 2003. There you go, 20 years. I think the things about, so research into things like psychology approaches to kids and psychology methodologies and that kind of thing tend not to change too much over a short period of time for research, which is 10, 20 years or so. Some things do change a lot, but not so much. I think probably what's changed a lot since this book is the advancement even further about technology and that kind of stuff. He does talk about that in the book and frames it as a way of like, it's about new millennium parenting and the new millennium adolescent. So it's really designed to be about how things have changed since generations past, but it probably has changed a little bit since 2003 as well. This book is I think my review of this is a bit mixed. I think for one thing, the author's American, and so some of those cultural differences come through, particularly when we talk about things like curfew and parties and that kind of thing. I think it's a really different experience for American adolescents in high school to Australian children. And some of the analogies he uses are kind of sport-based, and so sometimes that comes through as a little bit different to an Australian reader in that they are more around baseball analogies and that kind of stuff, where we're like, what does that mean? It would be really great to read one that references AFLs, like AFL, not AFLs. I meant things like AFL examples and references and that kind of stuff. But the book grew on me. I think there are some really practical takeaways in there that I'm going to run through today. To give you a synopsis of the book, he talks about, in part 1, your child, the new millennium adolescent. So it's really about how adolescents are experiencing the world now, which is different to, say, for example, when we were adolescents, but more so even for our parents' era. I'll run through some of the things in more detail in a sec, but he also talks about new millennium parents, so understanding your role and accepting your challenge in terms of doing parenting a little bit differently. And then talks about field-tested strategies for effectively parenting your adolescent. And that's a section I think that's really helpful, those practical tips. So to start with, he runs through the adolescent brain and how it's a little bit different. And I think the theme from the book is a lot about how there are 2 sides to being an adolescent, and really the balancing of those 2 drives is what parenting a teenager is all about. And it's about the things that we're trying to balance is kids who are still developing and need our support and guidance and help, but at the same time have that drive for autonomy. And it's about really negotiating the balance between those things the whole way through, right from, tweens to teens, then through into early adulthood as well. So I was talking about how that some of the research in this book has come from a place where we used to think that the first 5 years of a child's life were the most important in terms of their brain development and that kind of thing. And then that's it, they're wired by then. But the research is really showing that that's not the case. There's a lot more rewiring and learning and growing and developing going on throughout childhood and then still into adolescence as well. And so this brain development can create new thought pathways. The other thing that's different is that sometimes teens might not be as great at recognizing things like emotions, social emotions like anger and fear and that kind of stuff. So they've got this wiring that's going to let them grow and learn and make mistakes in order to learn, but then at the same time be a little bit unpredictable in their management of emotions and in how they interpret our emotions. So a guide is for adults to respond not with raging, hurtful punishments, but with carefully crafted responses intended to calmly but firmly teach children to become functional adults. And really, the idea about yes, your teen is crazy, first of all, I think maybe is not such a nice way to talk about it in the current social, political realm. We don't really joke about being crazy anymore because it's not that helpful. But he's trying to take an approach that's, just trying to really acknowledge for parents how, I wanted to say crazy, but can't really, how unpredictable and difficult to understand the adolescent years can be. So I was talking about the balance between, on the positive side, that impulsiveness and risk-taking in adolescence is critical to growing up and becoming their own person, and will form that personality they need to tackle the challenges ahead. The downside is that while that's happening, your adolescent already sees themselves as an adult, deserving of all the grown-up privileges that go along with it. So you're balancing that need to respect where your child thinks they're at and wanting to learn and grow and become more independent, but at the same time knowing that they're not quite there yet. So you can see it's really this balance, I think. Right from when kids are little, we're teaching them to grow and become more independent, but in the adolescent years, it's really much more week to week, month to month negotiation of that balance. One thing interesting when he's talking about the adolescent brain is how often kids won't know why they have made a decision they've made. So there might be some silly decisions that he refers to as insane there that kind of seem like, why did you do that? But mostly they won't be able to answer why. And if they don't answer you, it's likely because they can't and they won't be able to explain what happened. And that's because the brain impulses are coming in fast and strong before the judgment can kick in. So sometimes there will be those critical lapses in judgment. And he describes that occasionally happening is totally normal and not to be too alarmed and worried about that. Talks about mood swings as well, so that's a bit of a funny part in the book. Those out of the blue mood swings can set land speed records, which is kind of funny. And so, interestingly, another point he makes is that adolescents are essentially the same as adolescents were in the previous generation, even 2, 3, 4 back. But what's different is a bit of a societal shift in where we view adolescents more so as adults and start treating them that way and expecting that much stuff for them. But again, there's a little bit of a alternate theme there in terms of that kids or teenagers still want adults to be in charge. In his book, Michael Bradley's a psychologist, or I think they call them, therapist in America, talking a lot about how teenagers tell him that it's quite scary when all the teenagers are in charge at these kind of parties and stuff. They want adults to be in charge, but we kind of expect them to be responsible, and they're not quite there yet. So it's not just that kids want more responsibility than they're ready for, but sometimes it's that parents expect more than they have the capacity for at that age as well. So talking about the adolescent brain and how it's different, and then interestingly talks about peer groups and friendships. What I think is really interesting is this approach saying that peer pressure does not come from peers, it comes from within each child. So it's really, don't think so much about the negative peer group, but think about who is your child and what experiences are they having, and how does that relate to who they're seeking out? They're likely to seek out peers who are having similar experiences to them. And so if you think about it, for us as adults, we hang around people who are similar to us. We're not. So if your children are, if your teens are hanging around kids that you don't think are a positive group, try and think about what is your child, how are they connecting with that group? Is it that they also feel like school is hard, or they don't have anybody who likes them, or they don't have anybody to listen to them and be there for them? And that can help you meet those needs, and perhaps by doing so, then your kids will be interested in spending time with other kids who also have those needs met, and it can change the pull from one peer group to the other. And a topic that I think I talk about a lot with parents too, that your values are most powerful to your child. So rather than rules, thinking about promoting values is a better way to go. That gives enough guidance, but a lot more flexibility there as well. The next things he talks about are change. And so adolescent change. I did a webinar on this just last week, I think, about in ADHD, that our capacity to change as parents is so much greater than the capacity of our children. And the same is true for adolescents as well. So they're really learning a lot and growing and developing. But if things aren't going well at home, it's going to be much easier and more effective for you to think about what you can change as a parent to support them, rather than how they can change. He also talks about then what's normal and what's not, in a chapter that I kind of skimmed through because this is what I do every day. But in terms of acting out, in terms of eating was another thing, and then mood as well. So talks about how you can tell the difference between what might be typical for a teenager and when is the point when you really need to get some help. And that is a chapter that I think would be useful for a lot of parents, because it's so tricky to know how significant your challenges are if you don't know what's normal. So where will I go next? I think that leads into, so what they say is about some of the really important parts of parenting a teenager is, firstly, to not care about whether you're cool or not. It's a hopeless endeavor anyway, he says in the book, but really respect is what kids are looking for in terms of looking up to a parent. So he calls it a critical tool for adolescent parenting is respect. And so there are some guides in the book about things that he's learned through practice that increases a child's or adolescent, teenager's respect for us. And so one is he hears a lot that they respect honesty, and particularly when we admit to our mistakes, they respect consistency, and our continual showing up for them, even though they say that they don't care. And then it talks about some things that they mean that they kind of lose respect for us as well. And so that is really what it comes down to. There's examples that I won't go through, but what it comes down to is whether we are handling our own lives in the way that we expect them to handle theirs. So, in terms of, are we living up to the values that we expect of our kids? Are we treating other people well? Are we treating ourselves well? And if we're not, then that respect for us as a person gets lost. And then from that, the power that I guess we lose that power that gives teenagers a reason to look up to us. And that's the power that lets them follow what we're our guidance. So the next part is because part of that is about parent relationships as well with each other. And if we're not respecting our co-parents, then our kids aren't going to respect us. So there's a few guidelines in there for what you can do. And so I'll move now into talking through the practical tips in the book, because I think that's a really good focus for us to have. Team building techniques for parents enduring adolescence. So he does try to build humour into these like titles of chapters and that kind of thing, to really acknowledge that it is tricky. And I think humour often takes out the sting of how difficult these things can be to talk about. So there are, I think, 5 tips to go through in terms of working with your partner through this time of adolescence. The first one is to date your partner. So I think that's about trying to keep that relationship there aside from just about parenting. If you've got that strong relationship already, then that's the basis for then being able to do this co-parenting stuff together. This is assuming you're together. If you're not, that's a different story, and that's covered in the book as well. So that's probably one you leave out if you're not together, but the others can apply, I think. And so the second one is to support your partner almost unconditionally. And that's really so that you are a united front. Tag team is the third point. So I think if your energy's fading, your partner can step up to the plate, and that can be on a day-to-day basis, or even just month to month. If the relationship you've got with your teen is a bit iffy, maybe tag them to have a go at doing this stuff for you for a little bit. The fourth part is about using pep talks. So encouraging your partner about how they're doing, the co-parent, and letting them know that you've got their support and what they're trying to do with your teen, you've got their back. And number 5 is keep your sense of humour. I think because, like I mentioned before, humour can just diffuse emotional situations really well. And sometimes it will be, I think what he's talking about when he says crazy is just that real unexpected, like unbelievable kind of turn of events. And sometimes it is like that. And you can't believe what your kid has done. And, keeping the humour in that part is a really healthy way to deal with it without getting too emotional. And so the next bits in the book I think are really good are 10 commandments for parenting your teen. The first one, he's written them all as thou shalt. Obviously, he's taken that commandments thing quite funny. But so the first one is thou shalt be as the dispassionate cop unto thine own child. Be cool, not the fool. I just think this bit maybe gets lost in translation a little bit, and it wasn't quite my humour. But so I've summarised them rather than talking about them exactly how he's called them. But so if we're going through the 10 commandments, really the first one, and these are really good strategies. So I learned a bit from reading these, and it helped me think about things in a different way. So while the book's a bit hit and miss, these strategies are really useful. The first one is not to let the anger muddy the issue when you're trying to deal with your teen and their behaviour. And so they talk about it as in if you stay dispassionate or calm, you're talking about your child and their behaviour, and those two things are connected. But if you come in being angry, then your anger is going to get in the way of those things because your child will be thinking, hang on, that's not fair. You're like attacking me, angry at me, and they'll lose sight of the fact that you're talking about their behaviour. So the calmer you can be about it, it keeps the focus on your child and their behaviour rather than your emotional reaction. The second one is to listen, even if you don't think it's true, basically. So doing lots of active listening, and your child's going to see things in their own way, which might be really different to how you see things. But it's just not worth engaging in the fight about that stuff. One example he gives is about school. Like, don't try and persuade them that school is interesting if they think it's boring, because it'll just distance you from them. Just, say, try to listen and acknowledge and affirm how they're feeling. The third point is to keep calm, speak carefully and wisely. So it's really about, if you shout, they won't listen. Basically, that's it. So you've got to be that calm, grounded, respectable person for them to listen to you. Well, they'll think you're crazy. Number 4 is thinking about building in some time for you to consider what they're asking and make your decisions. So he talks in the book about how often your kids will ask you stuff when you're in a rush. So they might ask you something just before you have to drop them off at school or just before you have to be at sport practice. So his suggestion is to build in 15 minutes of buffer time so that if they ask you something, you've got a bit more time to respond. I don't know how practical that is, but I like the other alternative, which is to say that you just need to wait before you need to think about it and talk some more before making a decision. So if there's time and you've got the time, spend it with them. But if there's not, say, we just need to talk about this a bit later. It'll probably take 10 minutes. So I'm not going to decide until then. Don't get backed into a corner, basically. And then number 5, forgo needing to look cool. That's just going to change your decision making and not be helpful. 6 is no physical discipline. I think that's really about respect as well. And modelling also. 7, apologise after every stuff up. So they are really useful strategies, and I guess not strategies, but they're like guidelines to keep in mind. The next one is to honour your child's identity. So you want them to be able to be themselves, and things like that don't matter too much, like about the clothes they wear and the haircut, that kind of thing. Let them take risks and try things out and see who they want to be, because that's acknowledging to them that they're allowed to be their own person, and they will evolve, but they need, into the person they're going to be, but they need to try stuff out first in order to be able to know who they want to be. And then the 9th one is don't forget who you are and stay true to yourself. The point here, I think, is that you might experience some character assassination on behalf of your teenager. They can say stuff that's hurtful, and it's important to just remember who you are and be true to yourself, and not let their views, kind of be dispassionate about that as well, and calm, and know that half the time they don't mean it anyway. But you know who you are and just be true to that. And the 10th part is to know that this too shall pass. Yeah. So in elaborating on that, I think he talks a little bit about the goal of rule setting as well. And that's another part I think has got some really practical tips. But he talks about it being about identity and not about rules. And so boundaries are the limits you put in place that is, he describes it as finding the point beyond which parents are unwilling to compromise. But the thing is, for limits to work, your kid has to voluntarily agree to observe the out of bounds lines. So if you're putting rules in place for no reason, they're less likely to engage. But if you work with them to develop the boundaries, you'll get a lot more buy-in. There's a paragraph in there that I think really sums it up well. And the author says, when he was small, the purpose of the fence was to keep him alive and healthy. So talking about the fence is the boundaries or barriers. As he grows into adolescence, this purpose must be enlarged to include a whole new batch of goals whose common end is to enhance identity formation. This is done by allowing identity exploration with some element of risk, but within an open field of choices. He can sort these choices out, try some, and then embrace a few. This is how he learns who he is, and knowing who he is the best defense he can have against everything he faces in the adolescent world. So I think boundaries are still important, and that lets kids know what we won't accept. But within that, let them have freedom about some things, like maybe it's the subjects they choose at school, because those choice is how kids then learn how to make better choices. So yeah, I really like that way of thinking about it. So the last bit I want to run through is some tips for negotiating rules and decisions, because I think that's something that parents can often find really tricky to know what to do. It's got problem-solving strategies in there in the last chapter, or in one of the chapters, chapter 11, which I think is such a useful chapter for parents, because it runs through lots of problem areas, like maybe aggression, handling chores, curfews, the internet, driving, all of that kind of stuff. And he has some guidelines about how to think about it, with some critical things to do and critical things not to do. And so that's something that's really handy to guide how you make the decisions. More than that then talks about, it's got a section on like maybe some common areas of difficulty. So things like handling, things like when to get help, sex and dating, the internet, drugs, and handling your child's rage as well. So if teenagers are really angry, balancing safety with privacy. So lots of areas that might be particular concerns to you on and off throughout your child's adolescent years. So that it is really good to have that as a guide. But I'm just going to finish on talking about the tips for negotiating the rules and decisions, because these are some great guidelines that I've put a red sticky note in and highlighted, because I'm going to use them as well in my decision making. The first is to keep it dynamic, and so you can change the rules and decisions based on circumstance. So be really responsive and negotiate with your teenager. The second one is start shifting the power from you to him. So a guide there is that if they want to do things, you can say yes, but move over some of the responsibility to them as well. So avoid answers if they're asking about things, see what they come up with in terms of problem solving, the rules and decisions, and let them have a bit of power in this discussion because they're going to have to start doing these things for themselves. The third one is to provide options for your teen to choose within a set of parameters. So providing options within your boundaries. So they're talking here about like not wanting their child to stay at home, and so saying things like, sorry, staying at home alone doesn't work. But you can come with us on vacation and bring a friend, or you can stay at grandma's, or, so you're saying, no, that's not okay. But within this, there are a couple of options that you can choose from. The fourth is to know where your boundary lines are and keep these clear in your head and your child's head. So, and I guess then within that, everything's negotiable. The next point, I'm going to say quietly because I've got a teen at home today, but it's never disclose your enforcement options. This one I like a lot because the example they're giving is about like not drinking when they go to the formal. You don't want them to know what the punishment is so that then they'll be weighing up the decision in their mind. Is it worth, if I do drink, is the punishment too serious or is the trade-off worth it? Don't really want them to be doing those kind of, that kind of math. The next one is what I mentioned before a little bit. So offer to swap increased autonomy or independence with responsibility as well. So that, for example, if it's that, about, for example, ready to have my own car now. Oh, that's great. Now maybe you need to make some phone calls to find out, like, so you can budget, like how much do the services cost? How much is petrol? All of that kind of stuff. So, and if they're like, oh, can you ring and ask? No, you can, because you want the independence, so you take the responsibility. The seventh point is let your teen make some scary decisions on non-lethal but important issues. Err on the side of letting them try. It's their life. They've got to learn to do these things for themselves and have fewer rules that are clearer. So if you've just got one or two or three like non-negotiables, but the rest you're happy to run with, that's going to be a lot better than having heaps of rules. And to build the rules with respect, not with contracts. So if a child feels respected, they become more interested in negotiating this stuff with adults. So rather than, handing down the rules, try and respect them and work with them on it. So then there's information in there about how to enforce the rules, and a really interesting point he makes about the rules and boundaries is that it says kids will hate you if you have boundaries and they'll hate you if you don't. It's a paradox, right? So kids hate having boundaries and rules, but when kids don't have boundaries and rules, they feel like they're out of control and they don't feel safe and secure, and they will end up hating that and hating you for it as well. So you're going to be the bad guy either way. You may as well do it in a way that's safer for your child. And that's where those guidelines of being respectful and negotiating as much as you can throughout the process really come into play. So I guess the summary is that probably for you, if you don't mind this idea of like, yes, your teen's crazy, but loving your kid without losing your mind, if you don't mind that tongue-in-cheek kind of approach, then it's great for you. If you find that's a bit grating and disrespectful, then you might not enjoy the book. But maybe what you would get out of it is flipping through to the parts where it's got some really clear advice about the things to do and the do's and don'ts of each particular area. But there's a lot in there that is useful. And the author talks about the content areas but then provide some examples from conversations with teens he's had in therapy, or also with parents where or some case discussions about some examples of situations and how these things apply. So it is really useful. I think it's a big transition from parenting kids to tweens and teenagers. So any kind of upskilling is good. So I would recommend the book. Yeah, if you do read it, I'd be really curious to hear what you think. So get in touch and let me know what you would give it. I think I gave it 4 stars. It's really practical and useful, but just culturally a little bit of mismatch there, but definitely useful. So let me know what you think if you listen. And hopefully the practical tips I ran through today will help you in thinking about managing those things with your teen at the moment. Stay tuned next time. We're going to talk a little bit more about teenagers. Thanks for listening. Thanks for listening to this episode of Parent Like a Psychologist. If you found it helpful, please share on Instagram so other parents can benefit too, and tag me at Leanne Tran Psychology so that I can say a big thank you. Head over to leannetran.com.au to join the village for bite-sized psychology tips straight to your inbox. I really hope this podcast has brought a new perspective and you a step closer towards a calm parent and a thriving child. Have a delightful day.